In this video, I'm going to show you how I phase align my drums and get them ready for mixing. Anytime you work on a recording that has used multiple mics, you'll come across phase issues that have to either be dealt with while tracking or in post. There's plenty of things that we can do with our drums in post to thicken them up and make them sound punchier. You don't need fancy plugins, and once you know what you're doing, you can do this in a minute or two. Let's zoom in on our snare drum to start with. In Logic, we can come up here to our waveform zoom, click and hold, and then we can drag this to zoom in as much as we want. Let's find the very tip of this snare hit right at the front. Snare top and snare bottom are out of phase. We can see that the waves are going in opposite directions here. So to start with, we need to flip the phase of that snare. Now, you could deal with this while tracking if you have an interface or a preamp that has the ability to flip the phase at the channel. If you don't, it's going to come in looking like this. Basically, in Logic, there's two options. You can come to your channel strip and go down to Utility and add the gain plugin. All we have to do is click phase invert, and that's going to flip that signal, not visually, but just at the plugin. So they will now be in phase. But I'd prefer not to have a plugin that's just going to sit there for that reason. I would prefer to just double click on the waveform, opens up the wave editor, file, make sure we're in this tab, come over to functions, click on that, go down to invert, and it's going to flip it. And then that's done. Don't need a plugin running, sorted. Now we can see that looks pretty good. For the snare bottom mic, I don't really bother nudging it around. It sounds good to me and I leave it as is. Let me show you what these sound like when they were out of phase. You can see on here, the low end is much more focused. And you can hear when they're out of phase, it sounds thinner. And that's not what we want. So let's carry on now. Let's go back to a snare hit. Let's zoom in, find the front of that snare again. And now let's go down until we find our overheads, these two. Now we're just going to drag these over and line them up. Now, assuming you watched my video on how to record pro drums in your home studio, you would already have these in phase with the snare drum because we have made sure the distance from the snare to the overhead left and overhead right are exactly the same. If your overheads are looking a little bit like this, you might have to drag one over and line it up. But go and watch that video so you know how to perfectly phase align this snare while tracking. So that looks good to me. Same thing, we're going to come up, move all our spot mics, drag them over, make sure they're as close to that as possible. Hi-hats and ride. So we can just have a look at our snare up here. That looks pretty good. So let's have a look at our toms. Let's find a fill. Here we go. Uses rack and floor tom. Zoom in again. Now with this one, I have my overhead set up as drummer's perspective. So that means that the hi-hats are on the left and the rack tom. And then on our right overhead is the ride and the floor tom. Only a crazy person would mix from audience perspective. I mean, when you're air drumming, it's flipped. You're lefty. That doesn't make sense. It's good for left-handed drummers. Now I have to find the overhead left, which is where my rack tom's positioned, and I have to find my rack tom up here and drag it over and line up the initial hit. Now, do the same for the floor tom, but this time I have to look for my overhead right down here, this one, and then I got to match it up with my floor tom up here. Just drag it over. Done. Now let's look at our kick. So what do you notice straight away about this kick compared to the snare drum over here? The phase on the kicks is flipped. It's going up first and then down. We look at this one, it's going down and up. If we look at our overheads down here, it's down, then up. So we're out of phase with our overheads. So let's just do the same trick again. Open up the wave editor, invert the phase on the kick in, invert the phase on the kick out. Or use the gain plugin and phase invert there. These two mics look pretty in phase to me. You can see at the end here, it gets a bit out of phase, but you look at the start, and the phase is good. Now the problem is you'll never get them perfectly phase aligned all the way along there, right? So as long as the start of the transients are lined up nicely, we're going to get a nice punchy impact from the two bass drum mics combined. So if your mics looked a bit like this, yes, definitely move them over, line them back up. But where they were, pretty much perfect for me. Let's have a look at our overhead, right? Let's find the point where the peak goes up. So that halfway point between the down and the up. We're going to put our playhead right there, and then we're going to line our kick mic up with that. Just drag it back a smidge, right? Now, it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to get these 100% looking exactly the same. And that's why we're aiming for this point here. Sitting it on that in-between point of up and down on the overheads generally works pretty well for me. So now that they're all lined up, let's have a listen to how this sounds. Sounds punchy, right? Now, let's have a listen to what our kick mic would sound like if it was out of phase. So it's just more focused and punchy, and you can hear that when they're in phase. Let's talk about the room mics. Generally with room mics, I don't like to shift them. The distance from the kit is what's creating that space, that ambience. So I'm not going to drag these over and line them up with the snare or line them up with the kick. I don't think it sounds as good as if you just leave them and then just play around with flipping the phase and seeing what sounds best. Generally, I'll just chuck on the gain plugin, flip the phase, and put it on both of these, my stereo room mics. What I'm going to do is solo the kicks and the room mics together and then just listen and flip the phase and see what sounds best to me. I'm listening to the low end a lot because I want to hear what sounds fullest and punchiest. Let's add the snare drum into the mix of that. So I like the sound of that. I think when the room mics are flipped, the kick sounds deeper, fuller, and the snare sounds a little bit more focused at the fundamental. I'm going to keep it with the phase flip like that. I also have an ambience mic here. We can do the same thing with that. So I think that one sounds better without any phase flipping done to it. So let's leave it as is. Let's hear everything together now. So it sounds fat, focused, and punchy, and that is exactly what we want. Now these are ready to be mixed, and we don't have to worry too much about phase. So I hope you found this useful and that you can tackle some phase issues in your drum mixes and improve your sound. Make sure you drop a comment below. Let me know you watched the video and what you thought. Hit like and subscribe. There's going to be plenty of content coming to the channel, and I'll catch you in the next video, guys.